Hi, and welcome to part 3 of my Women Pharmacist Writers series, featuring an interview today with Dr. Megan Freeland. This is Kim Newlove, host of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. If you're new to the show, welcome. I am a pharmacist by training, but I made a career transition to voice actor and podcast host. Among other things, I narrate audiobooks for women pharmacist authors, and I provide medical narration to clients in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. I was inspired by my nonverbal teenaged son with autism to leverage my identity as a pharmacist and my speaking voice to launch my voiceover business, The Pharmacist Voice, in 2017. My son Craig helped me realize the power of having a voice and using it. Each week, I alternate solo podcast episodes and interview shows. The solo shows are about some aspect of being a pharmacist, a voice actor, a pharmacist podcaster, or my career transition from pharmacist to voice actor and podcast host. And my interview shows feature a variety of people who use their voices to advocate for something, educate in some way, or entertain so that you are inspired to use your voice too. This is episode 129, and you can find the show notes with links to anything mentioned today on my website, thepharmacistvoice.com. You can also find my medical narration demo and a link to my online course, Pronounce Drug Names Like a Pro, on my website. That website again is thepharmacistvoice.com. If you are a pharmacist who's interested in becoming a medical writer, you are going to love my Women Pharmacist Writers series. I'm loving it too. Now, if you missed parts 1 and 2 of the series, it's no problem. You will still understand part 3 today. But if you do want to hear parts 1 and 2 of the series, check out the links to those episodes in the show notes. Or you can find them on your favorite podcast player. They are episodes 125 and 127 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Episode 125 features Dr. Janan Sarwar, and episode 127 features Dr. Brittany Hoffman-Eubanks. My Women Pharmacist Writers series will conclude with part 4 on Friday, January 14th, 2022. My guest will be Dr. Maria Glachowski. Again, welcome to part 3 of my Women Pharmacist Writers series. Let me tell you a little bit more about my guest, Dr. Megan Freeland, then we'll dive right into our interview. For years, Megan Freeland worked as a public health pharmacist for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But over time, she realized she was missing the opportunity to apply a creative flair to her writing career. Megan set out on her own to build a health content marketing company. Through StockRose Creative, LLC, Megan supports innovative health organizations, helping them use the power of words to reach their target customers and clients and turn them into raving fans. During our conversation, we cover a wide range of topics. Megan shares not only how she uses her voice as a health content writer, but also how she handles writing for brands, many of which have their own voices, personalities, and writing styles. You will also hear Megan share how feedback has influenced her, a little bit about her Health Writing for Health Professionals program, how she uses her voice as a Spanish-speaking pharmacist, pitfalls about content strategy creation, her favorite part about being a writer, some challenges she faces, tools and resources Megan uses, and more. We pack a lot into this 1-hour interview. I really enjoyed talking to Megan, and I continue to learn from her by watching her YouTube channel. There's a link to that in the show notes at thepharmacistvoice.com. The second hour of this episode is actually a bonus. Let me tell you about it because I have never done this before, and I'm excited. There's a first time for everything, right? I reached out to a fellow woman pharmacist podcaster, Dr. Ijama Ikocha, and I asked her if I could include her interview with Megan from the Black Women Pharmacists podcast as a bonus after my interview. She gave me the green light, and I am pleased to say that you can enjoy an encore presentation of Ijama and Megan's conversation in this podcast episode. Thanks again, Ijama, for permission to rebroadcast. While I was researching Dr. Megan Freeland for our interview, I came across Ijama's interview with Megan, and it really helped me understand Megan's background and what Megan has already shared. Even though I intentionally recorded a different interview, mine focuses on how Megan uses her voice. I liked Ijama's so much that I am resharing it on my podcast. The way I would describe it is a comprehensive interview chronologically covering Dr. Megan Freeland's career through May 2020. That's when it was published, so it's about a year and a half ago, but it is so well done. I wanted to share it. Please stick around for that bonus, and if you would like to learn more about Dr. Ijama Ikocha and the Black Women Pharmacists podcast, visit blackwomenpharmacists.com. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Megan Freeland. Hi, Megan. Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice podcast. How are you?
Hey there, Kim. I am so excited to be here with you today. I'm really excited for our conversation and to see where it goes.
When we were talking right before we pressed record, I was telling you how excited I am because I have thought about becoming a health content writer, a medical writer, however you want to call it. And you coach health content writers. And that is part of why I invited you on the show. I also want to talk to you a little bit about your experience as a health content writer and also anything else that you want to share, like how awesome you are on social media at promoting yourself. You are fantastic. I actually watched your YouTube video on your Peloton bike.
Oh my goodness, yes.
No, I mean, you share not just what you do, but also who you are, and how you teach, by talking about your Peloton bike. You are teaching people like what it's like to have a Peloton bike. You are teaching. And I really enjoyed it.
It's fun to do those kinds of videos that feel a little more lighthearted. I think that as a writer, I'm used to helping companies tell their stories to their clients or potential clients. And after several years of doing that, which I still love, by the way, I also wanted to make more space to tell my own stories. And they don't always have to be so heavy and deep. I mean, they can be, but I think that's one misconception that people have, is that if you're sharing on social media or sharing your story in any type of platform, that it has to be something like profound and heavy or tragic or, just some weighty emotion. And it doesn't always have to be that way. So it's been nice to be able to diversify the types of stories that I tell.
Absolutely. But as a writer, I can tell you, you have identified the enemy. There is a lot of misinformation about health on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that one of the messages I've heard as I've done my research on you, to get ready for this interview, is that your mission is to fight that. And I'd love to hear how you use your voice first as a health content writer who fights misinformation online.
So if for anyone who we haven't met before or connected before on LinkedIn, I'm a Black woman, and I am originally from South Carolina, from Columbia, South Carolina. And I grew up in a really close-knit family where we have interesting, hilarious conversations about everything that you can think of. But one thing that I noticed from a very young age is that there is a lot of misinformation about really important topics in different communities, and not just online, but like in actual real life interactions with people. And I always felt like I wanted to be able to speak in an educated fashion to kind of counter some of those ideas, not in a rude or disrespectful way, but just to offer another perspective. And as time has gone on, obviously, like, 30 years ago, the landscape of the internet and how we connect and send and receive information has evolved and elevated. And so now I think we're seeing how quickly misinformation can spread, not only within communities, but between communities and beyond communities and globally. And that misinformation has direct impacts on people's livelihoods and their actual health. Like, it's not an abstract issue, it's a real issue because information impacts behavior. And so it's really important for me to, like I decided when I was a child, to use my resources and my expertise, my experience and my skills to try to counteract that so that people can live healthier lives and at the very least have accurate information that's relevant to the lives that they live.
That's fantastic. And I also know that you come from a public health background. And I know I didn't have you go through your story from pharmacy school to present, but I think it's easy to just put it out there that you started off in the public health space
Yeah,
and fighting misinformation from that sort of a focus area. I think really kind of shares what you're trying to do. It's like public health is important. And if you're coming from that background, what you just explained really shows your why.
exactly. When I was in public health in a role at the CDC, it was a health communications role. And that was really the first time I had a specific experience where I realized how important health communications were, not just to other healthcare providers or clinicians or people with science backgrounds, but also to the general public. And I got to see firsthand how scientific and health communications teams at the nation's leading public health agency really took that information and massaged it in ways that were more digestible and actionable for the general public. So I really appreciate having had that public health experience because that really opened my eyes to the world of opportunities that are available in writing. I always say that medical writing for healthcare providers, we think of publications and manuscripts and maybe PowerPoint presentations and things like that. But there's a whole other side of patient-facing or consumer-facing communications opportunities that really allow you to exercise your creative brain, use your voice, right? Combine that with maybe another brand's voice to really have the most impact on your reader or whoever is consuming the content that you're creating.
Yes. And the way that we all engage people, it can be different, right? There's different writing styles. Can you talk a little bit about your writing style?
Yeah. So writing style is interesting because as a health content writer, when you are working with different companies, you have to kind of find a middle ground between your own writing style and that company's writing style or their preferences. So that's always really interesting because sometimes those don't exactly match up. The way that how I would describe my writing style is very like Southern Black woman who uses AAVE, like African American Vernacular English. And you rarely see my writing style in pieces that I share on social media, on LinkedIn, or pieces that I've written for clients. The reason for that is because my writing style doesn't necessarily align with a lot of the brands that I write for with their writing styles. But what I do is try to identify, even if our writing styles don't match up, I like to write for companies where our audiences are similar. So even if you are not creating your content in the same way, with the same personality, with the same tone, the audience who we're speaking to, there are similarities between those audiences. And I think that writing style is something that also takes time to develop. So like if you ask someone who has never written before, they might look at you like, what are you talking about, Kim? I don't have a writing style because I don't write. But one of the fun things about starting to write is that you get to practice with different styles. You get to figure out what comes most naturally to you, what's a little more difficult for you. And that time of experimentation can be really fun and exciting for new writers too.
I want to say that I try, at least in my show notes, to write the way I talk.
Mm-hmm.
And when I speak on a solo podcast, I try to talk the way I write. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you do that too?
It depends.
Depends on what the client's paying you to do, right?
Exactly. It really depends. Um, One thing that I can say is as a new writer, right, when you don't really know what you're doing, it's much easier and more comfortable to just prioritize working with anyone, right? Prioritize working, just getting clients so that you can get that experience. And so sometimes the tone and the style and those kind of editorial perspectives are not as pressing in that moment because your goal is really just to get practice and get experience. But what I've noticed is that over time, as I've become more comfortable in my health content marketing expertise, and I've really established myself in this space, I feel much more confident being very particular about what types of clients I work with. And I'm able to say, hey, this client seems like someone who's open to me using my voice a little bit more to kind of pushing limitations or perceived limitations a little bit more. And it's more of a fun process for all because there's more of an alignment there. In the beginning, I was just like, I'll write however you want me to write. Just let me know, send me your style guide.
Mhm.
I can adopt that and we can move forward. As you kind of get more experience, you have more of an ability to say, hey, this is my expertise, this is my point of view, this is my style. How does your brand style align with that? And maybe we can move forward, maybe we can't. That's also fine.
Yeah, it sounds like you challenged the status quo just a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's good. I know what you mean by bringing your own voice into what you're writing. Uh, I know this is gonna sound crazy, but even as a voice actor and to some extent a podcast host, there's there's this time where you're testing out your voice and you're trying to find it. Like, literally, you know how you talk during an interview just talking to the person across the table. But when you get into your booth, right? That's what I call my recording space.
Mhm.
And you're recording an audiobook and you're trying to speak somebody else's truth in this book. For example, Asha Bohannon hired me to do her audiobook for Impact Pharmacist, and I'm not trying to imitate her. It's not like I'm a comedian that's doing an impression, right? I'm not trying to sound like her. I'm trying to sound like me. And it can be hard to let that out because I'm a little guarded because I'm like, is the person listening to this going to like this?
Right.
I don't know. But you have to just like let go a little bit, and it takes time and experience to find your voice because like you were saying, at first you're just doing it because somebody's paying you to do it. But then you push that status quo a little bit and say, "Hey, this is how I really write. Can we go with
Mhm.
this?" And then
Yeah.
what you're finding is that people want that and they're paying for that and they're seeking you out for that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's nice because you almost get paid to find your voice because as you're working with these clients in the initial days and months of your freelancing journey, you're getting paid to figure out to practice and to figure out what your voice is and what your preferences are. And I don't think that you can figure out what your preferences are if you're not actually practicing, right? You could just write for yourself on your own for free. That's also an option. But, a lot of us don't just have all the free time in our day to write every day for no type of compensation or return. So I think it's a nice way to get out there and practice and kind of figure out what works best for you and what doesn't. And I love your approach of um, kind of being in your booth and grounding yourself in the fact that you are trying to not sound like someone else, but to really sound like yourself. And I think that if you're not in this kind of writing or content creating space, this process can seem a little bit abstract. But I think it's a really important one to keep in mind for anyone who is thinking about starting or kind of in the beginning stages of their own journeys.
Very well put. Yes. You have to find your voice, literally. And you can only do that by doing the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So go out and do the thing.
Even if you're bad at it, you're going to be bad at it in the beginning. That's
Yes.
fine. That's expected. I look back on some of my work from 2017 and I'm like, wow, I can't believe I'm here today because this is not that great. But, over time, it comes together.
Right. And getting feedback is important too, right? Tell me about
Exactly.
some of the people who have influenced you in the way of getting feedback about your writing, whether it was good or bad. Talk about the feedback and how it changed or solidified what you were doing.
Yeah, I'll give an example of negative feedback and an example of good feedback. So one of my first clients, very, very first, um, I do not remember the name of the website, this person's name. I actually kind of buried this whole experience because
Sorry I brought it up.
it was not comfortable, but it's a good lesson. So this person was creating a website for, I think it was skincare, or skin health, I should say. And so he wanted a post about acne. I don't remember what the specific angle was, but it was about acne. And we were kind of in the discussion stage about whether I was going to join his team as a freelancer or not. And so we agreed that we would do a paid test project or paid test article. And he warned me in advance. He said, I can be a real stickler to work with. So, which is the reason why he wanted to offer a test, just to see if we kind of gelled together as far as writing style, but also just in terms of personality. Spoiler alert, we did not. I chose to exit the relationship after this test article. But what I realized as we were going back and forth with revisions, and we probably went through 5 or 6 rounds of revisions, which is not the way that I handle client work these days. But what I realized was that even though this was a health content piece that he wanted created, it was something designed to live on his website that if potential customers or clients came to the website, they could use as an educational resource. His approach to creating that content was much more aligned with something that you might see if you were writing a manuscript or, an article for publication. I disagreed with that approach because I did not feel like this information was going to translate well to a person who did not have a medical background in the way that he wanted to write it. So there was very much a difference between our strategy in approaching the article, the style of writing in the article, even as far as just the level that the words were written at. He was really trying to write for a collegiate audience when his potential clients and customers were not that. So because of that, there was a lot of critique and negative feedback. And what I learned from that experience was that I needed to be more selective about the type of work that I was taking on, because what was happening there was that there was dissonance between his approach to this content and my general approach to health content. We were not aligned in the way that we view patient education. So that was a really important lesson that I learned. And I'm really glad that I learned that lesson early on, even though it was very uncomfortable and took up a lot of time. I would say the good feedback. I used to write for GoodRx. They were probably one of my longest freelance writing clients. I wrote for them for at least 2 years. And my editor at the time, she's no longer an editor. She still works at the organization, but she doesn't do editing. But she was incredible. I attribute the growth and the evolution of my writing probably 80 to 85% to that editor. We use Google Docs and track changes. So that's kind of the process that I tend to use for edits and revisions and things like that. But her comments were always so she would not only share what she was suggesting, but why she was suggesting it. So I could follow her thought process and I could learn how editors think because she was telling me why she was giving that feedback. She didn't approach it as like a one-way communication, like I, the editor, am telling you, the writer, what to change. It was very much so like opening the conversation to say, hey, I see that you put this paragraph before this one. Why'd you do that? Do you think a switch might be better? If not, why not? And it was a very communal relationship where we were both able to learn from each other. So that was hands down the best editor, writer, and feedback relationship I've had as a health content writer.
Yeah, I like what she did there because basically she's saying, this is what I see. Do you see the same thing? And can we
Exactly.
move forward? That's important. That's important in a marriage too.
That's so true. And communicating that, right? Like verbalizing it, because she can't read my mind. She can see what I wrote, but she doesn't necessarily see why I wrote it that way, right? And I can see her suggestion, but I don't necessarily see why she made that suggestion. So opening it up for more conversation allows us to share the whys behind what we did or what we're thinking. And as a result, create a piece that is going to be maximally impactful for whoever is reading it on the other end.
Yeah, that's true collaboration there. And I love that story. That's fantastic. As for the gentleman who it didn't work out for, you discovered something important that I wish I would have discovered when I first went into voiceover. And that's that my voice isn't right for every project.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you had a similar experience. Your writing voice is not right for every project.
Exactly.
Just because I can speak doesn't mean we're right for every project. And I wish I had gone into voiceover knowing that. And I love that you shared it because I think people need to hear it for one thing, but any entrepreneur needs to hear that. You have to clarify your message of what you are offering so that the right client comes into your life.
Mm-hmm.
On that same topic, I know that gentleman wasn't your right client. Who is your ideal client?
That's a great question. So my ideal clients are either digital health companies or innovative health companies, even if they're not specifically digital health. And especially those who either have primarily Black audiences or who have a segment of their audience that is Black. And the reason for that is because when my approach to health content strategy and health misinformation is to make sure that we're approaching this from a culturally competent and strategic point of view. And so if you are just kind of looking at, I don't know, the health condition a person might have or the disease a person might have, and you're trying to design health content to address that condition or that disease state, that content can be important and it can be helpful. But it's most helpful if that content is also specific to that person's culture and their background and the way that they live, like something that they can apply that works within their everyday life. And so I really like working with clients who are very attuned to that and who are not afraid to be specific in who they are talking to and what types of behaviors or actions they're hoping to stimulate or to generate some enthusiasm around.
Well said. I heard on another interview, I want to say it was the one on brown skin stories with Ijama,
Mm-hmm.
how you were talking about being engaging and giving actionable information. And I don't care what the skin color is. I think everybody deserves to be spoken to in a way that is engaging, like they feel like reading it because it actually looks not boring. And there's something in it for the reader, the what's in it
Exactly.
for you message. I love that. So I like what you're doing with the Black community, but also for any community, we all need writers who think like you. I love it.
Absolutely. And I love that you put it like that. We all need writers who think like you, because one question that I get from pharmacists or other healthcare providers who are interested into going into health content is, Well, aren't there a lot of health content writers already? And the thing about any type of content, not just health content, but any type, is that there is always room for a new perspective because all of our perspectives are different. And there are going to be other people out there who share your perspective that you can be maximally impactful for. It's the other reason why I encourage writers to find a niche or a specialty area that feels really good for them, because you're going to perform your best when you are writing for an audience that you can relate to, or that you're passionate about, or that you have some level of expertise in. So that doesn't mean that you can't explore other audiences as well. But in terms of like, if you're really hoping to take this into a career in some way, I think it is invaluable to find a space where it's not hard work, right? I could have written that article that guy wanted me to write in the way that he wanted me to write it. And I did eventually, but it took 5 or 6 revisions. And that was because I didn't want to write it that way, because I didn't think that was going to be maximally impactful for that audience. So you can do a lot of things. But sometimes if you're doing something that's not aligned with your exact strength or your experience, it's just going to be a harder lift. And as someone who was building a business, having clients that are hard lifts is not a good strategy for really building a scalable business. You need to find a lane that you feel comfortable in and that comes naturally to you, even if not in the beginning, over time, because that way you're able to maximize your expertise and your impact in that field.
Excellent points. Excellent points. I see so much parallel between what you do and what I do, and I don't mean to keep inserting myself in this, but I went into what I do thinking that, oh, I'm a pharmacist and I speak medicalese with ease. And I thought that I would just love it and every day this would be my favorite thing to do. But I'm finding that I also like podcasting and helping other people with podcasting stuff. And even though I narrate audiobooks, I also like helping other people who want to narrate their audiobook do that, you know? So it's like you have to almost just get your feet wet, figure out where you fit in. And I love how you said, find your lane, because it takes trial and error, doesn't it?
It does. It takes so much. And I think one of the distinctions between people who are able to kind of jump into these non-traditional, we could argue about that word, but these non-traditional opportunities is they're willing to go out there and try things, even if they're not sure that they're going to work or that they're going to like it or that they're going to stick with it. Because sometimes the value, at least in my experience, I'll speak for myself, this is 100% of the time, the inherent value is not necessarily in the thing that I'm doing. It's in learning what I like, what I dislike, what I'm good at, what I'm not so great at, where I want to go in the future, where I'm pretty sure I don't want to go in the future. I would not be able to figure out those things if I were not actively creating, actively moving, actively, like you said, participating in trial and error, because the feedback loop from those experiences is to let you know, yes, maybe, or no. And then you pick a new step. Yes, maybe, or no. And then it just kind of evolves and iterates on itself from there. So I'm really glad you said that. I think that's a great point.
Yes, everybody needs to hear that. And all these comments that you're making, I'm sure, are what makes you a fantastic coach for health content writing. So, why don't we jump into that next and let's talk about that side of your business?
Okay.
What's going on with that? How does somebody get started?
Yeah, so I started the name of my coaching program is Health Professionals to Health Writers, and this program started in January of this year. So it's incredibly hard to believe that it's almost a year of this program, but
Congrats.
thank you. The reason I started it was because I have been a health content strategist since 2017, and one of the things that as a service-based entrepreneur, you kind of hear about as you're growing is thinking about what's next, right? Like, how do you increase or scale your business? And so for service-based businesses, creating an agency is like the next step, right? Once you reach your capacity as an individual service provider, then you bring on other folks who can help you deliver that same service to more clients. Well, to be completely honest with you, Kim, being an agency owner is not something that ever interested me. But until the pandemic, I had not been forced to admit that to myself. So it's something that was in the back of my head. And I know that it's one of the reasons why I didn't hire on full-time employees to my business. But the pandemic forced me to acknowledge that. And so I started to think, one of the nice things about an agency is that you're able to multiply your impact. So for me, with my professional mission being to fight health misinformation online, how do I multiply that impact? Well, if I'm not going to do it through an agency, then I want to think of another way that I can do that. And so I figured that in my experience, there are not a lot of other healthcare professionals, whether pharmacists or physicians or whoever, who are also health content writers. There are a lot of health content writers who have no health background, no health education, no health experience, and they don't really know how to research accurate and detailed health information. And I think that's a problem. And so I think that more health professionals should be health communicators. And one of the lowest barriers to entry to entering health communications is through freelance health content writing. And so that's why I created the program, which is dedicated to helping pharmacists learn how to replace a portion of their pharmacist income through freelance health content writing, also giving them the ability to use their clinical expertise and background to help fight health misinformation online.
Very good. How does somebody find this program, and what exactly is it called?
It's called Health Professionals to Health Writers, and you find the program on LinkedIn on my profile. My name is Megan N. Freeland on LinkedIn, and there is a lot of information about it there. There is also a YouTube channel called Health Writing for Health Professionals, which is where you'll find a lot of the videos that I record on Wednesdays, which are all about tips for getting started in health content writing. And kind of sharing the lessons that I've learned along the way.
I think I saw that YouTube channel, and you have upwards of 30 videos at this point. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there are about 30 right now. And so there will be about 35 by the end of the year. So a lot of the videos that I publish on LinkedIn, they're cross-published on YouTube, but it's a little harder to go back in the archives on LinkedIn. So YouTube is a nice organized way to kind of find what you're looking for and catch up on videos there.
Yes, and you are quite the Instagram person too. You Instagram user, I should say. I have seen all kinds of videos there too. Are those the same videos that you're talking about that go on YouTube and LinkedIn?
Yes. Yeah, they're pretty much the same. So I try to make sure that pharmacists who are, prefer different platforms have access to the information as well.
Gotcha. Well, I have a lot of catching up to do because I only discovered you a few months ago. I think we've been connected for a few months now, and I see a ton of content coming out from you. And selfishly, I made this Women Pharmacist Writers series so I could get to know you better and Brittany Hoffman Eubanks, because both of you teach courses on becoming health content writers. And that is something that I have considered using my voice to do, especially because if there's anybody out there who also wants to create the audio component, boom, I'm your girl.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a wonderful way to look at it. One thing that I encourage my students and even just other pharmacists who I talk to in direct messages on LinkedIn is to think about your skills, right? So this might be an unpopular opinion, but being a pharmacist is not a skill. You are using a collection of skills to execute your role as a pharmacist. And so I think people need to be more aware of what those skills are. Some of them are similar between different pharmacists, but you probably also have your own unique skills that you can also bring into whatever other opportunities you want to embark upon. So, for example, Kim, you have a skill of using your voice, right, to tell a story or to deliver a story. That's a skill. I have a gift of using written words to tell a story. That's a skill. Thinking about what your skills are, whether or not they're directly related to pharmacy, and bringing that into whatever interests you.
Absolutely. I have heard a similar message many times. I love the way you put it. I had Blair Thielemeyer on the podcast a few months ago, and she was talking about leveraging your identity as a pharmacist, and you are expert enough to do something. And what you were just saying is, whoever else you are, why don't you leverage one of those skills? And I love that. That is exactly what I've done. I'm not trying to toot my own horn here, but what you're talking about is exactly how pharmacists need to be thinking if they want to do something non-traditional.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, toot your horn. I will toot it for you.
Toot, toot.
Toot. You're doing an amazing job. And I think
Thanks.
it's also really important for those of us who are using our skill sets creatively to be vocal about that, because it gives other pharmacists, I hesitate to say the permission, because they inherently have the permission. We don't have to give them permission, but the space to think about how that can apply to their own lives and what skills they can find in themselves and how they can apply them. I know I always look to others around me for inspiration of how I can think differently about something, or how I can try something new, or how I can solve a different problem. So I think by being vocal and visible with what we are doing in our businesses and in our passions, that we also create space for more pharmacists to do the same in their own lives. So toot, toot, my friend. Keep up the great work.
Toot, toot indeed. Thank you so much. I love that. I am one of those people who has a huge case of imposter syndrome, and I will admit it. One of the first guests that I had on this podcast is Dr. Lisa Orbe Austin. She is a counseling psychologist in New York City. She and her husband, Dr. Richard Orbe Austin, wrote a fantastic book called Own Your Greatness. And there's a subtitle too, can't remember it. The main title is Own Your Greatness, and it's about imposter syndrome and overcoming it. It's a workbook. I just love it. And I think that by going through that and also listening to the audiobook, because sometimes people absorb information in different ways through reading, through listening, through doing a workbook, etc. I'm starting to overcome it. It's kind of hard, but part of what you were talking about, tooting your own horn, has to do with also overcoming that imposter syndrome. And I don't want to like throw any any personal issues out here on the podcast, but some of us have things in our past that have created automatic negative thoughts, where if you think of going outside the box, then, oh, that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that was necessarily my problem, but I just have so many life circumstances that are really hard to overcome. For example, having an adult child with autism and pretty much no caregivers except for the school, and I wouldn't even call them caregivers, they are teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And having those life circumstances makes me think, I want to do this, but oops, I've got these life circumstances. And I'm trying to push beyond that and think thinkability first. That's what people with disabilities think. Like, well, okay, I can't do this, but what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think anybody listening to this needs that motivation, needs that affirmation that you need to think ability first, and don't be thinking like, I can't do that. Think, how can I, you know?
Yeah, I 1000% agree with that perspective. And I think that's another point that emphasizes how important it is, again, for us to be visible, because similarly, there are other people who might look at you and say, hey, I might have a child at home with autism or other types of special needs, but I see that Kim is doing XYZ. And so that tells me that there is a way, right? Because we all have different circumstances. We all come from different backgrounds. With this conversation on imposter syndrome, it makes me think about recent conversations that I've seen around it, and leaders in various spaces trying to contextualize the idea of imposter syndrome in the fact that a lot of people who experience imposter syndrome, it's not just because of, their circumstances or like internal perspectives of how they're seen in a particular space, sometimes these people like are entering spaces that were intentionally designed to exclude them. So that's not just imposter syndrome, right? Like it's a fact that this space was not made for me. So contextualizing that in like historical patterns and information. And again, like when you see people in those spaces, you know that whatever the reason, or whether it's imposter syndrome or, other more deeply rooted issues, I see this person who I can relate to in this space doing something meaningful. And I know that because they are there, I can also find a way to be there as well, or to be somewhere else that's more aligned with what my life circumstances will allow. I'll end this by saying that I experienced this a lot during, not so much this past year, but 2020 was a really difficult year being a mom of two young kids during a pandemic. And that initial shift, like in March and April, of all of my friends who had no kids, they don't have any, they're not married, they don't have a spouse, they just had all this new free time. Whereas I used to be the one with all the free time. And, while my kids were at school and I was working, and that shift was hard for me because I saw how much my output decreased and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. And over time, I had to reframe the way that I thought about that, but it took a long time. And it gave me direct insight into how that can affect other people in different ways. So I certainly empathize.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not trying to throw a pity party, but Megan, you were laughing a minute ago because I was pointing at myself with both fingers because you were talking about how hard it is because all of a sudden the kids are home and it's like, okay, my output just slowed down. I know you're like zero, right? I think a lot of people didn't understand what I'm dealing with until the pandemic. And again, I'm not trying to throw a pity party. I give you a lot of respect for having two very young children around the house and trying to work at the same time. That is incredibly difficult. And wanting to work. A lot of people used it as an excuse to quit their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But I have been through a lot with the whole caregiver situation and just trying to work 3 hours a day. That's what I always tell people I do. If I can fit something else in, great. But I mean, I take half of the kids' school day for me and my business. And I only have that much time. When the kids were home for the pandemic, I had this teenager with autism who suddenly didn't have a teacher. He doesn't have a laptop where he doesn't read, write, or speak. He doesn't know how to use a computer. When everybody with challenges got left behind when the pandemic hit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm bringing this up because I feel like people finally understand what I have been dealing with for years.
Yep.
When you don't have caregivers, there is no choice and you still have work to do, whether it's making beds, doing dishes, folding laundry, doing dinner prep, anything. Now you can't do it because your toddler is going to crawl on top of the refrigerator.
Literally.
Yes, yes, yeah. But I give you a lot of respect too, again, because I know you know what it's like to be me, at least during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully things are getting better for you. How are things now?
Things have improved. So my kids went back to school in April. Once me and my husband were vaccinated, we're like, all right, 2 weeks from our dose 2, this is when you all are going back to school. And that helped a lot, but it's still, as all the parents out there know, like it's still not normal, right? Because you have random closures, and if they get a cold or something normal that kids get, there's just a lot of back and forth. And I thrive on structure and routine, which I know a lot of other pharmacists do as well. So in a lot of ways, like I know my husband would say the in and out and the back and forth is almost more challenging than just them being home every day. I would disagree because I was the one who was with them every day, all day. So we have different perspectives on that. But it just kind of, I don't know, it just kind of is what it is. I try not to think too much about it because I was I don't know if I can say that I was clinically depressed, but I was in a really tough mental place in 2020 until about November when I got my Peloton, literally exercising in the morning. When I started doing that and did it for a couple of weeks consistently and started feeling better, I realized how bad of a place I was in previously. So, I think we're all adjusting the best that we can and just trying to ride this thing on out.
Yeah, that's right. Riding it out on a Peloton anyway.
Literally riding it out.
All right. I have a very different kind of a question for you. I don't get to ask this one much, but you are bilingual. And I would like to know which language you speak and how do you use your voice as a pharmacist with that skill?
Yes, so I am bilingual. I speak English and Spanish. I actually have a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish and had the exciting opportunities to study abroad, both during my undergraduate years and during pharmacy school, which was really cool. I don't use my Spanish skills on a day-to-day basis, but there are sometimes sporadic opportunities where I'm able to use my pharmacy voice and my Spanish voice together. So there was a contract-based job that I had a couple of years ago, and it was for an MTM company, a small MTM company. And they worked with a lot of different insurance companies across the country. And they were looking for a Spanish pharmacist consultant to come in and help with some of their contracts that were in communities and cities that had large Spanish-speaking populations. The funny thing is that I had actually applied for that role probably the previous year, just as something to help me keep my Spanish skills up. I never heard anything back from them. And then a year later, they sent an email and were like, hey, are you still interested in this? But it was good timing because I was saving up money for maternity leave. But I spoke with Spanish speaking patients about their medication histories, their profiles, counseling, all the MTM pharmacist things. And I did that for about 3 to 5 months before I took a maternity leave. So that was a really exciting way to, one, tap back into my clinical pharmacist skills, which I don't necessarily use frequently as a health content writer, but also to just have more conversations in Spanish, which I also don't get the opportunity to do as much as I would like to.
Very cool. You're the first Spanish-speaking pharmacist that I've called out on how do you use your voice as a Spanish-speaking pharmacist. It's just not something I get to ask very often. I think it's fantastic. I'm glad you were able to help that MTM company. And for anybody out there listening to you talk about this that might be a Spanish-speaking pharmacist too, do you know of how they could get in touch with that company so maybe they could have that opportunity too?
Yeah, the name of the company was My MTM Cares, I believe. I will send you an email and let you know what the exact name is, but I believe it's called My MTM Cares.
Thank you. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I appreciate that.
No problem.
Megan, I've got a few rapid fire type questions before we wrap this up. And the first one is, can you share some of your pitfalls that you've discovered about copywriting and content strategy creation?
Ooh, wow, that's a deep question. I would say one pitfall is being being so focused on the actual writing that you don't think about the strategy. And this is not just a pitfall for writers. This is also a pitfall for actual clients because some of them just want blogs and content to make their website look pretty, but without an actual strategy, they're not going to be using the content to achieve their business goals.
Ooh, that is a fantastic point. Is there another burning one that you'd like to share?
I think for pharmacists, I will say a common pitfall in terms of health content writing is not being able to reduce the grade level of your writing quite enough. That's something that I work with a lot, work on a lot with my students is bringing the grade level down a significant amount because we're used to writing very scientific information for other scientific people, but the people who are reading the health content in most cases don't have that same background.
That is an excellent consideration. And that actually leads into one of my other questions, which is it's about health literacy. How do you address health literacy in your consumer facing content without being patronizing?
That is a wonderful question. I think that telling stories is a great way to make points without feeling like you're watering down information for your audience. So, and this goes back to the importance of having a specific community that you're talking to, because one community might, one story might resonate with one particular community and it might have no meaning for another community. But if you can craft those stories in a way that is relevant to the people that you're writing to, that's a great way to get across complex points without feeling like you're being patronizing or talking down to them.
Excellent point. That brings up a good point about anything that anybody ever does. Know your audience, right?
Yep, exactly.
Know your audience. Yep. All right. Next question is how do you like the research part of being a writer?
I like the research part of being a writer. I don't know if I would say it is my favorite part, but I do like it a lot. It's definitely the most important part for me. The writing is secondary because if you're writing based on shoddy research, the outcome is not going to be great. So the research part is the part that I spend the most time on. And that's when I kind of get my old school printer out and I'm printing out documents because I need to see them in front of my face. I need to spread them out. I need to flip the pages. And I like that feeling.
I like tactile experiences too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Even though,
I'm still a physical book reader.
yeah, I do that too. I listen to audiobooks and I love physical books, especially if I loved the book. Off mic, we were talking about Donald Miller and Storybrand. That
Hmm.
is a fantastic book. But I have the book and I have the audiobook and I have read and listened to both more than once. Yeah. But I love what you just said about you have to print stuff out and touch it and look through it and everything. I'm like that too. I'm very tactile.
Yeah, especially if it's a complex topic. I remember one blog post that I wrote last year was about the new vancomycin dosing guidelines. And so I had to read the guidelines and all the research that supported the guidelines. And, I needed to mark those pages up. So it was great to have them kind of printed out and spread out on my desk, which is really a dining room table in front of me.
Whatever works. And I'm glad you shared that because somebody out there's listening to this thinking, "Oh good, I'm normal."
Yes, exactly.
All right, next question. What's your favorite part about being a writer?
My favorite part of being a writer is seeing the final product. Because sometimes there's a project where it's like, how exactly am I going to pull this off? This is a lot. This is a big project. And the feeling of starting from nothing and creating something is just the best feeling in the world to me. So I love to see the final product. And I especially love when I get feedback on that final product from people who were not involved in the project at all, because that's just really affirming and validating of all the time and work and energy that was put into it.
Yes, and that's authentic, positive feedback. It's unsolicited. That's the best kind.
Yes.
Absolutely. Now, the next question is what are some challenges you face?
I think a challenge for me, and this is one that comes up a lot because sometimes pharmacists will ask me if being an introvert is something that is prohibitive in being a health content writer. And I myself am an introvert, which I think people find hard to believe, which is hilarious to me. But I'm an introvert. And so one of the challenging things is having to turn on whenever I'm meeting with a client or meeting with someone who might be a client. If I'm in the mood to talk, then that's great. But if I'm in one of my introverted moods, which is the majority of the time, then it takes energy to get myself in the place where I want to interact with another human being. So I think that's a challenge that sometimes folks don't think about because they are just focused on the writing part. But like, there's a lot of other things that go on in order to have a successful freelance health content writing business.
Megan, I never would have guessed in a million years that you're an introvert.
That's so funny to me. Yeah, I'm an introvert. I'm not shy. I think sometimes people conflate shyness and introvertedness. I used to be shy, but now I'm just an introvert.
That's all right. That's all right. I think you're killing it in life. I mean, you're doing great things as a writer. You're a mom, you're a wife, you're using your voice. It's all good.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Now, I think I've got 2 more questions and then we'll wrap this up. The
Okay.
first one is, what are some tools and resources you use often?
So I think I mentioned Google Docs earlier. That is by far my most used tool. I also use, as far as like the content creation side and marketing my business and my coaching program, I use Canva a lot. Obviously, LinkedIn, which is my favorite platform to be on. But for client management, honestly, Google Docs and Dubsado. I use Dubsado to manage my clients and my projects and keep track of everything.
I've never heard of Dubsado. What is that? Is that like Airtable or Excel or what?
I think it is more like, I wouldn't describe it like Airtable or Excel. It's a client management tool. So it's where I can upload client documents. I can send them emails from within the system. I can upload their contracts there. It's kind of like if you join a program and they have a hub where you can kind of go in and get your documents and videos and stuff. It's whatever that thing is. I don't know the official term, but it's whatever that like hub that you can access is.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's a business tool I hadn't heard of. I always learn things when I interview people. It's fantastic. And then when you create all these fantastic posts for YouTube and Instagram, what is one of the tools or resources you use most for creating that content?
For creating that content, definitely Canva. And also, I would say my Logitech camera, because when I'm recording, like when you see me now, this is my Logitech webcam that I have attached to my computer. And if I'm not using that camera, then I'm just using my good old iPhone. So all of the tools that you need are really accessible. And
Well, you're doing great. I have no problem following you or watching your content. Everything you put out is easy to watch and has good messages. And I'm not just saying that. It was so easy to watch your YouTube videos. And by the way, I think your Peloton demo video on YouTube got like the most watches or views out of
yeah,
anything that I saw. Would you agree with that?
yeah, it's definitely the number one.
That was cool to see. I was like, "Wow, look at this athlete." That's cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, you gotta let people get to know you too, and you're doing it, and that's fantastic. Megan, those are all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for being on the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Is there anything else that you wanted to share before we wrap this up?
Well, I want to thank you, Kim, for inviting me to be on this podcast. I really love seeing your journey evolve and listening to all the amazing people that you have on this show to talk about how they're using their voices. So thank you for having me. If anyone is interested in learning more about my journey or seeing some of the content that Kim and I have been talking about, again, you can find me on LinkedIn at Megan Freeland or on YouTube on the Health Writing for Health Professionals channel. So I look forward to meeting you and learning about your interest in health content writing.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing all that. And thanks for sharing how you use your voice on the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Take care.
Thanks, Kim.
I love the pearls of wisdom that Megan shared, especially this one. Finding your voice as a writer and your ideal clients is important. When you find your writing style and someone wants to pay you for it, it's truly a win-win situation. It's easy for you to write, and it's the content that they want. I love it. Now, I also plan to watch Megan's Health Writing for Health Professionals channel on YouTube and learn from her. I have honestly been thinking about trying my hand at medical writing or health content writing for a while, and I need to know what Megan knows. If you're interested in health content writing or medical writing too, I want you to check that out. Let's wrap this up. Thank you for listening to episode 129 of the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. Please visit thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. You'll find links to Dr. Megan Freeland's LinkedIn profile, YouTube channel, business website, Instagram page, and more in those show notes. I also included a link to her Peloton bike review just for fun. Megan, don't hate me, you know it's good. My dear listener, if you liked this episode, please share it with a friend. And subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist's Voice podcast in your favorite podcast player to get each new episode delivered to your smartphone every time a new episode comes out. Thank you again for listening. And now for the encore presentation of Black Women Pharmacists Season 2, Episode 15. This is an interview with host Dr. Ijama Ikocha, interviewing Dr. Megan Freeland. Enjoy.
Opinions expressed on this podcast are those of me or my guests and do not reflect the views and opinions of our respective employers, organizations, committees, other groups, or individuals.
My thought process was, I'm getting the pharmacy education that I need in school. If I'm going to create a career in public health, I have to find some other kind of way to get real exposure to public health work in public health settings and make connections with people who work in public health.
Hey guys, you're listening to Brown Skin Stories representing women pharmacists, the only podcast that will give you a firsthand experience into the life of a Black woman pharmacist. I'm your host, fellow pharmacist Ijama, and I want you to tune in to learn firsthand about the different career paths available to you after graduating from a pharmacy school and learn all the steps that you need to take to land the pharmacy job of your dreams. Let's get started. Hey guys, welcome to another episode. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Megan Freeland, who is not your average PharmD. She's the CEO of StockRose Creative, LLC, a healthcare copywriting and content marketing business helping innovative healthcare organizations better engage and educate their communities through the power of words. Megan received her BA in Spanish from Emory University and her Doctor of Pharmacy from Mercer University College of Pharmacy. Following her graduation, Megan pursued a regulatory pharmaceutical fellowship in drug information sponsored by Purdue University and Janssen Scientific Affairs. 10 months into her regulatory fellowship, Megan found out she was pregnant. Learn how her resilience and quick thinking led her to a health communications fellowship with the CDC. She subsequently took a role as a public health pharmacist supporting the CDC in medication safety, health communications, and regulatory affairs. She's an Atlanta transplant, originally hailing from South Carolina, and enjoys connecting with fellow multi-passionate millennials through her podcast, The Lazy Millennial Lounge. On this episode, we chat about how she leveraged another pharmacy student to land a summer fellowship at the CDC, her role as a regulatory pharmaceutical fellow in drug information, her role as a health communications fellow, what she does as a healthcare and copywriting content expert, and finally, her advice to multi-passionate students and pharmacists who may be confused about what to do next. Guys, I learned so much from this episode, and I know you're about to, so let's just get started. So first and foremost, tell me, why pharmacy?
Like many pharmacists, I think initially I thought that I wanted to go to medical school. That's what I had talked about all my life, pretty much, was wanting to be a doctor. And as I often say, if you're, a smart young Black girl and you tell people you want to be a doctor, nobody's going to question that. They're just going to be like, great, go be a doctor. You can do it. Let us know what you need. And so it wasn't until I was like maybe 1 or 2 weeks into my freshman year of college that I thought about what the life of a physician, like a traditionally practicing physician, would actually entail. And I decided that I didn't want to pursue that route because of that lifestyle. And so I started looking into other pathways to still have an impact on healthcare, but that didn't involve becoming a physician. So I had a family friend who was a pharmacist, and she had been kind of pressuring me to look into pharmacy, but I really didn't pay any attention to what she was saying until I decided that I wanted to go a different route. So I looked into pharmacy, and at the same time, I went to Emory for undergrad. And if you're familiar with public health at all, you know that Emory's public health school, Rollins, is one of the best public health schools in the country. And so because of the proximity, I had started hearing about public health. So I kind of looked into those two areas, and I talked to my mom about it. She was very upset that I decided I didn't want to be a physician. And she was like, well, I don't really know much about public health, but I know that if you go to pharmacy school, then you will come out with a doctor of pharmacy. So at least you'll still have a doctor in front of your name. So you should go to pharmacy school. So that's pretty much that I made the decision to go to pharmacy school. I had also had a work study job during college that was sort of related to drug information, and that kind of piqued my interest in how medications work. So it wasn't purely because, you know, she said you should go to pharmacy school, but that did factor into my decision. So I always try to start the conversation by indicating that I decided to go to pharmacy school to learn more about how drugs work. I did not go to pharmacy school to be a practicing pharmacist. And so I always had that in my mind from the very beginning, like before I even started pharmacy school.
That's actually a really different explanation than I hear a lot of women say, you know, why they actually end up going to pharmacy school, right? Yours was specifically for how to learn how drugs work, right? And you learn that obviously in pharmacy school, but not to be a practicing pharmacist. So then tell me a little bit about you went to Mercer, right?
Mm-hmm.
For pharmacy school. So tell me about your experience there.
I had a positive experience at Mercer overall. As I mentioned, I went to undergrad at Emory, which is also in Atlanta, and Mercer's professional school campuses are in Atlanta also, even though the main campus is in Macon. So when I started pharmacy school, I'm not going to say that I was a loner, but I didn't seek to build real connections with my classmates or really my professors, to be honest, in the beginning, because I already had a strong and solid network of people in Atlanta. And so I kind of just went to school, learned what I needed to learn, and went on my way. The other reason for that was because, as you know, and many others who might be listening know, most pharmacy schools, the tracks that you go down are either, you know, community or institutional pharmacy, it's like, are you going to do a residency or not? And it's pretty much you need to do a residency, whether it's in the community setting or the institutional setting. And because my goal was not in either of those tracks, my goal was, again, to learn how medications work and figure out how to apply that to a career in public health. I didn't feel like anyone could really help me get to that point. And on the occasions that I did try to find people to help, there weren't really any resources there. So I would say the first half of my pharmacy experience was pretty like cut and dry. I mean, I did get involved in some organizations like SNAFA, worked on some of the committees, but it wasn't until maybe like my last 2 years that I actually started like building connections with my classmates and, you know, certain professors who I had closer relationships with. But overall, it was a positive experience. I just had to do a lot of work on my own, take a lot of the initiative myself in order to sort of craft the career that I wanted to create, because there was no set route there for me to just like kind of follow the steps. I had to figure out the steps on my own.
So when you were going through the motions of pharmacy school, you know, in terms of crafting your own career or deciding how you really wanted to use your pharmaceutical degree, what path did you have planned out for yourself? What were you thinking? Because I know you pursued a fellowship in drug information, which I do want you to tell us about that. But I guess what was going through your head at this time?
I wouldn't say that I was discouraged, but I was just sort of uncertain about what the end of that path would look like, because in addition to not having anyone at Mercer that I could really tap onto and like gain insights as far as how you make an impact in public health as a pharmacist, I didn't know any pharmacists, period, like even outside of the Mercer network that were doing something that I felt like I wanted to do. I just didn't have that exposure. I couldn't see what it looked like, so I couldn't see what the end of my path looked like. So there was a lot of uncertainty there. And so what I did, despite that uncertainty, was basically I made my best guess. And so at Mercer, in one of our classes, we had required community service hours. So most of my classmates would do like, a health fair or something that was like semi-pharmacy related. I went to a local women's center in Atlanta and I volunteered there on their health education and training committee. So my intention, my thought process was, I'm getting the pharmacy education that I need in school. If I'm going to create a career in public health, I have to find some other kind of way to get real exposure to public health work in public health settings and make connections with people who work in public health. So that is what all of my extracurricular activity was dedicated to. So that's why I joined that health education training committee, where I could help put together workshops for the people in the community on like topics related to women's health. And I started thinking like after that, okay, what else can I do to get more experience in public health? The CDC is down the street. I've always dreamt of working at the CDC. Like that was really, really what I wanted to do. So let me see what types of fellowships they have available. So I went to the CDC website, I looked for fellowships and basically like figured out which ones I was eligible to apply for. I found one that was called it's a long name, it's James Ferguson Emerging Infectious Diseases Fellowship. And it's a fellowship for all types of pre-health students, including pharmacy students. So I then was like, okay, I want to do this summer fellowship. It's a 9-week program. So I went to LinkedIn and I searched for that fellowship name in the search tool. And I found all the people who had that fellowship listed in their profile. And I just cold messaged them like, hey, I'm interested. Well, if they were pharmacists or pharmacy students, and I cold messaged them. And I said, hey, I'm interested in doing this fellowship program. I saw that you've done it before. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions, such as, and then I provided examples of the questions that I had. One pharmacy, she was still a pharmacy student a couple of years ahead, and she responded back and was like, yep, let's talk. Long story short, we talked, we had a phone conversation. I've never met this girl in my life, but she talked to me for 2 hours about everything related to this fellowship, like the application process, what they're looking for. There were essays that you had to write. She offered to review my essays, everything. And I ultimately got that opportunity. So that was now 2 experiences that I've had in public health, like 2 very concrete, legitimate public health experiences that I've had, and I haven't even graduated yet. As I got closer to graduation, I still, despite that, wasn't really seeing a direct path into public health. And so I started thinking, okay, what can I do that will prepare me even more, to give me even more credentials, help me get my foot in the door per se. And so that's what made me start looking into fellowship programs. I honestly didn't start looking into fellowship programs until my 4th year, like the summer that my P4 rotation started is when I kind of started looking into fellowships. And the reason that I chose the one that I did, which was sponsored by Purdue, Janssen, and the FDA, was because it was the rotational fellowship and it had that FDA public health component.
So number one, what I'm picking up is you had to think outside of the box when it came to your own career and what you wanted to do in pharmacy, because you're right. I think a lot of times students are faced with, okay, you could do community, you can do hospital, you could do industry is always something that they mention as well. But you had to really find your own way. And I appreciate that because you are an entrepreneur. And then secondly, what I'm picking up is the way that you were able to network. And as a student, how did you even learn? Like, did you know, like, this is what I have to do? Like, because you mentioned that essentially you weren't networking in your earlier years in pharmacy school, but then you had to begin networking. And it looks like you were able to find students who weren't necessarily like, or individuals who weren't like 10 years ahead of you. You found students that were maybe like a year or two ahead of you, right? Mm-hmm. So what is the power in, number one, leveraging those connections of individuals that are relatively your peers?
I think Issa Rae said it best when she talked about like when you are trying to accomplish something. I think people kind of automatically think, who can I connect to that's ahead of me, that's above me, who can help pull me up? But there's power in looking out to see who is with you, and you can all help pull each other up. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I do think it's true that I had already kind of started dabbling in networking without really realizing that. But it's actually what happened after I decided that I wanted to do the fellowship that I think really demonstrates the power of networking and the influence that it had on my trajectory. So I can share a little bit about that. When I decided that I would think about pursuing a fellowship, it was right before the SNAFA, like that summer meeting. And so I went to the summer meeting at SNAFA, and they had that, I forget what it's called officially, but it's like that round table where it's like a kind of a job fair type thing, but not really. And so there's, of course, this room packed with people, and there was a table there from the Rutgers Pharmaceutical Industry Fellowship Program, which is, one of the premier industry fellowship programs. So I'm like, okay, well, let me go to the Rutgers table so I can meet some people, find out some more about this. Because the thing is, with fellowships, you have to remember, I'm in Atlanta. We have zero, maybe we have one pharmaceutical company that people kind of do stuff at, but there is very little industry exposure here in Atlanta. So I'm just kind of blind to it all, except for what I can research on my own. So I go up to the table. There's this girl kind of standing like in front of the table talking to people, and it's packed. Like there's probably like 20 or 30 people in front of me. So eventually I make my way up to her, and we're not even face to face. We're kind of talking across heads. There's like maybe 2 or 3 heads in between us. So I quickly introduce myself, say that I'm interested in fellowship programs. She might have asked me something like what types of programs I was interested in. It was a very quick exchange. At the end of the exchange, she was like, here's my cards. She reached over these people's heads and handed me her card. And she was like, call me tonight. Mind you, this is at the meetings. This is at the conference. So she's like, call me tonight. I'm like, okay. So that night, I called her. And she became my mentor, my coach, my sponsor, my advocate, my everything throughout the entire process from that summer all the way until mid-year. I probably talked to her every week. She helped me revise my CV. She introduced me to, she was a former fellow. She was maybe a year out of her fellowship program. She introduced me to fellows that she knew in the programs that I was interested in. She had me set up calls with fellows and preceptors from every program that I was interested in. We did mock interviews weekly up until mid-year. It was like she literally took me under her wing and walked me through the whole process. I still don't know to this day why she looked at me and said, hey, call me tonight. But I'm eternally grateful that I did, because knowing what I know from going through that process, I don't think that I would have had the success in that fellowship application and interviewing process that I did had it not been for her help and for being able to build those networks with all of these people that I would be meeting with at mid-year. Like if I had not talked to them before, that would have been the first time they were seeing my face.
Right.
Versus I've talked to these people multiple times over the past several months. And so, yeah, I'm eternally grateful for her support, but it just goes to show that you got to put yourself out there even when you're uncomfortable, because you never know what can come back, like what can come as a result of that.
Now, that is the power of networking. And thank you for sharing that story, because that holds some power. And I hope you guys are listening out there, because that gave me chills, Megan. I love it. So then you got this fellowship. So you are pursuing a regulatory pharmaceutical fellowship in drug information.
Correct.
Tell us about that experience.
So it was a really cool experience because it was a fellowship that exposed you to a variety of different areas. With a lot of the fellowship programs, you have say you have 1 year in industry. You will also have an academia component where you can do a couple of lectures, but it's in conjunction with that industry component. So you're not completely immersed in academia. You are just like a guest lecturer on occasion. Whereas in the fellowship program that I did, the entire first 6 months was purely an academia rotation. So I was a professor. I had office hours. I did numerous lectures. I graded things. It was really an immersion in academia that I thought I wasn't going to really enjoy, but it was actually one of my favorite parts of the rotation. That was 6 months at Purdue. And then my practice site while I was in that part of the rotation was in a drug information center in one of the hospitals. The next part of the rotation was at Janssen, and that was the medical information component. And so there I worked in the medical information department supporting Invokana. That was really interesting because I learned how much you have to actually dive into the research and really know the product in and out, like the back of your hand, in order to produce the content that the medical information department produces in a pharmaceutical company. But that portion of my fellowship was actually cut short when I found out that I was pregnant. And so I found that out. I think I was 4 months into that particular rotation when I found out I was pregnant. And I was devastated. And it was completely unexpected. I'm also very transparent about this. I had an IUD, so there was no way in the world that I thought that I was going to have to deal with that. But I did. And so that put a halt on everything that was going on as far as that fellowship program, because I was in New Jersey at the time. And my home base was still in Atlanta. He's now my husband, but my boyfriend at the time and we had a house there. And so I was helping pay for a house in Atlanta. I was paying to live in New Jersey, and I knew I couldn't do both of those things and save up money for a baby at the same time. So then it became, well, how do I get back to Atlanta and find a job? Long story short, that fellowship that I told you about that I did in pharmacy school, the CDC fellowship, I found a different fellowship program called the ORISE fellowship that had an open position in the same division that I was in before. The position was under a different supervisor, but it was in the same division. So I reached back out to my mentor from the previous fellowship, and I told her the situation, and she said, okay, I can definitely connect you with this person. I know her. So connected me with that person, did an interview, everything. And that just, God worked it out that way, because it was a health communications fellowship, and it was set to start in April, which was kind of when I was wanting to be heading back to Atlanta. And so I was distraught at everything that had happened, because I'm not a person to not finish what I started. And then with the fellowship programs, they're very competitive. So I almost felt like I took somebody's spot because I couldn't even finish the program. But my preceptors, it was terrible because, again, I had 3 preceptors. So I had to have this conversation with not one supervisor, but 3 supervisors on 3 separate occasions. But they were all incredibly supportive, and they helped me adjust my perspective. Specifically, my fellowship director was like, well, listen, Megan, I know that this isn't what anyone planned for, but ultimately this was your career goal. Basically what you wanted to get out of this program was you wanted to get the credentials to be able to work as a public health pharmacist at the CDC. And that's what you essentially have now, only having gone through this program for 10 months. So yes, it was cut short. You weren't able to finish the whole 2 years, but you got the job that you ultimately wanted. And when she said that, I was so much more at peace with everything that had happened. So that was how the regulatory fellowship ended, and how the CDC fellowship round 2 began.
Oh, I love that story, because it kind of brings us full circle now to the CDC, and we'll get into that a little bit. But in terms of, I guess, stepping away from the drug information fellowship and then going into a health communications fellowship, can you explain what the difference is between those two?
Sure. So drug information, imagine you are working at your pharmacy, right? And you have a question about some medication on your shelf? And you can't find the answer to that question in any of the traditional reference texts that you would use. So you say, let me call the manufacturer and see if they have the answer to this question. What the content that they send you by email or fax or like whatever information they send you, that's kind of how I think of drug information. It's very research-based, which health communications is as well, but the way that drug information is communicated is typically more formal, more scientific, more academic in nature. So if you think about a lot of the writing that, students you might do in pharmacy school, it's probably more of the way that you would communicate with another health professional. Whereas health communications can be similar in that you can be communicating health information to another health professional. And so you might write it in a similar way. But in my particular role, our health communications was directed towards the general public. So the program that I worked in was the CDC's Antibiotic Stewardship campaign. At the time, it was called Get Smart About Antibiotics. I think it's something different now. But the information that what we were doing was basically translating the scientific information, the research that our subject matter experts were doing, and translating that into a format that was more palatable, understandable, engaging for the general public. So we were doing like fact sheets, we were doing infographics, brochures, social media content. It was just it was much more like a marketing,
like externally facing information.
Yeah. So it was really you could apply a bit more creativity to it than you would say if you were creating like a drug information memo that you were sending to a physician who was treating a patient.
Got it. I love that. So then tell me about your transition into this new health communications fellowship, what your experience was there.
It was great. It was a shorter fellowship program, so I wasn't in it for long. But I was relieved because although I enjoyed drug information, when I got to Janssen, I realized that medical information, that process was a little bit boring to me. And so I appreciated the transition when I started the Health Communications Fellowship, because like I mentioned, there was more room for creativity and just, it wasn't as dry and scientific as I was starting to feel like medical writing was. So it was a really smooth transition. My team appreciated that I was a pharmacist, so I had a solid understanding of the research that the subject matter experts were creating, and they could kind of come to me with questions if they had them, as opposed to having to go, bother the SMEs. So yeah, it was a great transition, and it also helped me learn more about, I guess, like consumer marketing, like how to present health information in a way that the general public can understand. That's around the time that I started my personal blog, which at the time was called Your Friendly Public Health Pharmacist. I kind of wanted to provide health information to like my family and friends, because they were always, if you're the family pharmacist, people are always coming to you with questions. So I decided, let me create this little blog where I can send y'all, when y'all have these questions, you can stop blowing up my phone. But I was able to use a lot of these strategies and the tactics that I learned as a health communications fellow to my blog, which then kind of evolved into my freelance writing career, which then evolved into my content marketing business.
All right. This is the meat and potatoes. And this is where I'm really excited to get into like your own business. So Megan, or Dr. Megan Freeland, is also an entrepreneur, which is awesome. So tell me about how you transitioned into entrepreneurship.
So the transition was very unintentional. It kind of happened exactly how I said it did just now. Like I started that blog without any real understanding or thought about making money. But as I continued to publish on the blog, I guess a company noticed, and I still to this day don't know how they noticed, but they saw my blog and they said, hey, can you write posts for us? We'll pay you. And I was like, oh, people pay for this? Like, okay, sure, I can do that. Like that, it takes no time. I'm doing it for free anyway, sure. And so once I started writing for that particular company, I guess had a light bulb moment, like, well, if they are willing to pay me to do this, then I'm sure other companies would be willing to pay me to do this as well. And at the time, y'all are going to be like, you've had so many jobs. At the time, I was in a different CDC position that was more regulatory in nature. And it's actually really relevant, especially right now, because that regulatory position worked closely with the national stockpile. But like, we were writing to the FDA. And so you can imagine how formal and dry and like buttoned up that kind of writing was. And so I was really needing an outlet. So I said, sure, I'll write for these other companies because I can get that outlet that I need and make some extra income on the side. Started doing that, got to the point where I was making like a really sizable income, and I was kind of at my max as far as the time that I had available. So because at this point I had, I guess my son was 1.5, 2 years old at the time. And I also knew that I wasn't going to be renewing my contract in that regulatory position. So it came down to having to decide, am I going to try to find another, traditional position, or am I going to see if I can just scale up my freelance writing efforts enough to like cover my basic expenses? So I talked to my husband about it. I was kind of not really, I don't know, I didn't have the confidence to feel like I knew what the numbers were saying. Like, I knew on paper that I could scale it up, but the confidence internally, I didn't necessarily have at that point. But I talked to my husband about it, kind of told him what I was wavering between. And he pushed me in the direction of just saying, go ahead and see if you can scale up your freelance writing because it's going really well. You already have people who want to hire you. You just don't have time to work with them. So let's just see how it goes. He's like, you've had 1 billion jobs anyway. I'm sure that you can get another job if, it doesn't work out and you need to go back to work. So
great husband.
He really came through at that point in time. So that's how I ended up going into my freelance writing full time. But I also distinguished that when I left my job, in my mind, I was still just a freelance writer. I was not a business owner. That transition didn't happen until like 3 or 4 months after I quit my job. And I realized that if I'm going to continue this and make this work, I can't continue to treat this as a freelance situation. I have to treat this like a business. And so I hired a business coach, Jerisha Hawk. I name drop her everywhere I go. She's amazing. I still work with her to this day. And she kind of helps me tweak my mindset such that I was actually running a healthcare copywriting and content marketing business rather than just being a freelance writer. And I hope that distinction makes sense. Does it?
I think it does, because now you have an entity. What is your business called?
It's called StockRose Creative LLC. Yeah. So there's the entity aspect of it. And then I guess just like when I say the mindset, what I mean is, as a freelance writer, I would just go on, it's a job, like a gig board called Upwork. I would just go on Upwork. I would bid on different gigs and I would get them and I would write them and they would pay. And that was pretty much it. Like, that was all that I was doing. Whereas as a business owner, as an owner of a healthcare copywriting and content marketing strategy business, I am prospecting for clients. I am actively looking for clients. I'm actively creating content to draw clients in. I am actively creating content on my LinkedIn channel to communicate with people who might be my prospects. I have, invoicing systems and scheduling systems. Like, I have systems to support my process. I have subcontractors for when I was trying to take a maternity leave for my second child. I have more of an infrastructure that you would if you were thinking of a business. None of those things existed when I was a freelance writer.
Got it.
Okay.
That does make sense. That's helpful. So then tell me, who is your clientele?
It's kind of twofold. My clientele is digital health related companies and separately private practice healthcare providers. I do similar things for both of these audiences. But that's kind of the categories that they fall into. The thing with the services that I provide is I don't want to write the stuffy health content that I was writing earlier on in my professional career. One of the reasons that I decided to pursue my own business was because I wanted to have more control over the type of health information that I was writing. So what I write is designed to be more entertaining, more engaging, more fun. And you can imagine, like, at the CDC, even when they're trying to be like light and not so academic, there are levels and levels of bureaucracy, and all of that health information that we would create would have to go up every step of that ladder. And so by the time it comes back down from the top, it's just kind of, in my opinion, it's not what it starts as when the health communicator writes.
Not as engaging for the audience, probably.
So I intentionally work with companies, whether they are digital health companies or whether they are private practice healthcare providers, that are not afraid to like spice it up, because ultimately, like, my mission is to make sure that the health information that's getting out there to the public is not only understandable and relatable, but is also entertaining and engaging and actionable. Because if people are not interested, they're not going to read it. It doesn't matter how accurate the information is. It doesn't matter how well written it is. Because if people are not interested enough to read it, then they can't take in the information and they can't act on it.
Thank you for sharing. So let me ask you this, because I know a lot of people are thinking about this, and I'm even thinking about it now. Like, in order to be a healthcare copywriter or engage in content marketing for private practices or just different clients, if you wanted to be a freelancer, how do you get started if you don't have a fellowship?
Really, all you have to do is practice. So what you need is samples, because if you walk up to someone and say, hey, I'm a healthcare copywriter, I would love to write copy for your practice, they're going to be like, who are you? What can you do? Like, where's the proof? Basically, I hear what you're saying, but where's the proof? And so at that point, you would need to provide them with samples of work that you've done previously. Some people hear samples and they're like, oh man, I guess I'm out of the game because I don't have any samples because I've never been a writer. You don't have to have formally submitted these samples. I could go find a website right now and rewrite that website in a way that I think would be better and use that rewritten version as my sample. People don't have to know that this is not a sample that was submitted anywhere. They just need to see what you can do. So whether or not you have experience as a medical writer, you can always, or as a healthcare copywriter, you can always create your own samples and use that as your starting portfolio to get your foot in the door.
So suppose I was interested in doing this and I decided to create a sample and have it on my website. Mm-hmm. What, I guess, bodies or organizations can I tap into to ensure that I'm not breaking any rules and I'm abiding by all the regulations? I'm meeting all the criteria I need to meet as a copywriter.
There are none. That is not a thing. That does not exist in the industry. And I don't mean to say this in order to encourage people to do unethical things.
Absolutely not.
There are definitely people out there who do unethical things in copywriting, just like in the types of companies that they write copy for. But there is no certifying body, accrediting body of jurisdiction. There's no one looking over your shoulder to say, hey, you didn't create this for this company, or you put this information in here, but that's not really true. Like, people lie and copy all the time. Is that ethical? No, but they can do it. And unless there are rules within the specific industry that the copy is about. So I can give you an example. As a pharmacist or pharmacy student, you learn about the ways that you can talk about, supplements, things that you can and cannot say about supplements. You can't say that, this bark on this tree is going to cure your fibromyalgia, right?
Right.
Somebody will come get you. You can't say that. So of course, as a copywriter, that still applies. You still can't say that kind of stuff, but that is very subject specific. You see what I mean? So as a pharmacy student or a pharmacist, you already know the ways that we can and can't talk about different products. as long as you keep that stuff in mind and apply that to your copy, that's all you have to worry about. There are no other like rules or regulations as far as copywriting goes. This is the wild, wild west, and you can kind of take your creative liberties as you will.
I love that. Thank you for that explanation, Megan. I appreciate that. And I'm sure a lot of people listening are appreciating hearing that as well. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about you and your Lazy Millennials podcast. And so tell me about that podcast. Tell me how you came up with that name and why.
The full name is a mouthful. It's the Lazy Millennial Lounge podcast for multi-passionate millennials. And I actually came up with the idea for the podcast at the same time that I began freelance writing. What kind of stemmed that thought was, one, it was kind of being fed up that the way millennials were constantly portrayed in the media, as lazy, entitled. And then two was listening to a TED Talk by Emily Wapnick. It was basically, I forget the exact title, but it was kind of like why some people don't have one true calling. And I listened to that TED Talk, and I think it was like 11 or 12 minutes. And that 11 or 12 minutes changed my life, because I realized that I was a multi-passionate person, meaning that I didn't feel like there was just one thing that I could do on this earth and be satisfied with doing that one thing for the rest of my life. Like, I didn't feel like there was one particular career that I could have and be completely happy with and feel completely fulfilled by. Whereas I know that there are some other people out there who do feel that way. Like, hey, I can be an anesthesiologist and I can do this until the day that I die, and I'm happy about it. And this is all that I need to do. And I kind of had started feeling like there was something wrong with me, because I had my dream job, not on one, but on two separate occasions. And I still felt like there was something missing. So at that time that I had started freelance writing and thinking, maybe I don't want to stay at the CDC, I listened to that TED Talk. And I thought that I wanted to use my frustration with the way that many millennials were being portrayed and combine that with my newfound realization that I was a multi-passionate person and create a platform for fellow multi-passionate millennials. And so Lazy Millennial just was kind of like a play on words. Like, they call us lazy millennials all the time. It was kind of like reclaiming the word and making it something that was a little more positive. Like, sure, you can call me a lazy millennial, but this is what being a lazy millennial actually means. And so on the podcast, I have two different types of episodes. I have the Tuesday episodes where I interview fellow millennials who are starting their own businesses or side hustles or are doing really creative things within their traditional employment settings. And I talk to them about their journeys and about how they manage to incorporate that type of creativity into their lives and kind of like fulfill that multi-passionate nature in a variety of ways. And then I have the Sunday episodes, which are called Side Note Sundays, which are kind of deep dives into my personal business. And so I talk about things that I'm learning as a business owner, as a copywriter, and things that I have learned previously. And it's kind of more of a short, like 15 to 20 minute, not really teaching, but just sort of sharing the real time, like what I'm going through. One of my things was I didn't want the podcast to be like an entrepreneurship pushing podcast. You know what I mean? Like, I don't feel that everybody needs to be an entrepreneur, and I don't want people to get that sentiment when they listen to my show. But, and so in that same vein, I wanted to demonstrate the real behind the scenes process of starting and running and growing my own business. And so that's what the Side Note Sunday episodes are about.
Thank you for sharing that. Number one, I did listen to episode 72, and I will be continuing to listen to your podcast. So thank you for, number one, creating that platform. But you talk about being multi-passionate. I feel like I'm a multi-passionate pharmacist. Like, maybe I'm a multi-passionate person, but like, I don't know that, in pharmacy school, they do a really good job of telling you all the different channels or all the different careers available and really sharing how you can get from one career to the next, like the movement, you know? And so I guess what message do you have for pharmacy students out there who are probably feeling this tug or pull that are feeling that they're probably multi-passionate? What is your advice to them? Like, where should they begin?
My advice is always the same for that group of people, because I was in your shoes. My advice to you is do what you have to do in school, right? Like learn the information in your courses, do well on your exams, do presentations, do all that stuff, right? That the professors tell you need to do and that you need to do to have a great pharmacy school experience. But don't neglect your other skills outside of pharmacy. For example, as a pharmacy student, right, I made great grades, I did well, all that stuff. But I knew that I had a skill of writing, and I knew that I could use writing to create the career that I wanted to create. I didn't know how, but I knew that I could. And so I continued to hone that skill by joining the health education committee, by seeking that fellowship at the CDC. I worked on that skill constantly, even though that's not really a skill that, at least in my pharmacy school, was heavily emphasized. Writing was not heavily emphasized at Mercer at the time. So I encourage you to do the same. Do what you need to do as far as like getting your degree, but think about the other skills, the other talents, the other abilities that you have, and continue to hone those skills and talents and abilities while you are in school. Because as much as you think you don't have a lot of time right now, once your life starts rolling, you're honestly not going to have that much more time once you graduate. So use this time to continue to work on those skills. Think about how you might be able to apply them to pharmacy or maybe even another field that you might be interested in. But since you're in pharmacy school, think about how you can apply it to pharmacy and use that to create a career that fulfills more of your passions than just being a pharmacist. Because the other reason that that's helpful is beyond personal fulfillment. Y'all know how the job market is right now. It's not that great. And so to set yourself apart, like a residency, honestly, is not going to set you that far apart because all these other people are going to have residencies. All these other people are going to have decades of practice experience. You have to set yourself apart in different ways now. And your skills, your talents, your abilities are those ways, those things that you personally can use to make yourself stand out in whatever type of career you want to create.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. Definitely important to hone your skills and your crafts. We're wrapping up here, so I'm going to ask you 3 questions this is kind of new, but I'm adding it on here.
Okay.
So what is the best part about what you do as a health care copywriter and also a content marketing expert?
There's 2. One is the flexibility. Obviously, I don't have to go too far into that, but just being able to create my own schedule and modify my schedule around my family is priceless. But the other thing is when I start a project and I have no idea, especially if I have no idea how I'm going to do it, that's like an adrenaline rush. And so seeing the final product, however many weeks later, where I have created something out of nothing, something that has the power to like influence people's health decisions, that is just the most rewarding feeling ever.
Thank you for sharing. Now, what is the worst part about that?
I guess the worst part is sometimes the uncertainty as far as like business infrastructure things. And it's really because right now I'm doing this alone. I'm going to be hiring a virtual assistant soon who can kind of take some things off of my plate. But I think the hardest thing right now is being able to juggle it all at the same time. Because I'm not only the creative person, but I'm also the business person because I'm the only person in the business right now. So that would be the most challenging part.
Nice. Thanks for sharing. And then last question I have for you is one thing you do as a copywriter that people would be surprised to hear is part of your responsibility.
I think that when people find out what copywriters do, they kind of think that, you just write words and put them on a page. But a lot of companies because they start in similar positions, right? They start with a very few people and they're just trying to get to profitability. And so a lot of things they do in the very beginning stages are they kind of cut corners and don't really create a brand or create a real cohesive brand. And so when you come in as a copywriter, you don't just write words. There's also a lot of psychology and marketing expertise that goes into it. And so I have to do a lot of background research on people's brands that I don't think people necessarily understand is a part of a copywriter's responsibilities.
Thank you for sharing. And also, is there any way we can get, or I can post some material that you've copyrighted?
Yeah, I can find a couple of good pieces for you and send them to you, and you can decide how you want to display them.
I'll definitely share it on on the website, and I'll also share it on the show notes. So, Megan, where can people go to connect with you?
So the best place to connect with me would probably be LinkedIn. I'm Megan Freeland on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in learning more about the podcast or following me there, you can follow me on Instagram. That handle is at Lazy Millennial Podcast. And Lazy Millennial is spelled L-A-Z-I. And Millennial has 2 L's and 2 N's at Lazy Millennial Podcast.
Awesome. Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you. I really appreciate all of the gems you dropped on this episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Joma. It was a great time.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us at Brown Skin Stories on Instagram and Facebook, and make sure to join our ever-growing Facebook community at Brown Skin Stories representing women pharmacists. And if you haven't already, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And don't forget to join us for another episode of Brown Skin Stories representing women pharmacists at brownskinstories.com/pharmacy. Again, that's brownskinstories.com/pharmacy. Thanks for listening.